So initially we will hear from Bishop Eleanor Sanderson, the Assistant Bishop of the Diocese of Wellington, and Cardinal John Dew, the Catholic Bishop of the Archdiocese of Wellington. And their starter for 5 is, everyone needs a place to call home. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou whānau. It's wonderful to be here tonight and to speak to us on this evening. Today is a Saints' Day in our church. We have them most days, and they're days that remind us of amazing men and women in our world who have made a difference in the world. And they've made a difference by being people of God and changing our world in ways that mean we have a different inheritance to live in our day. And today is the Saints' Day of Mary Sumner. And Mary Sumner was a woman from England in the late 1800s. And she began an organization called the Mothers' Union. And that organization was begun because Mary Sumner was very concerned at the homes that many of the people in the parish where her husband was a vicar lived. She was concerned for the lives of the women in places of poverty who needed to create homes that were healthy for their families. And she wanted to create a way that the women who had that challenge of making homes, making places to live, good places to live, she wanted to bring those women together. The first time she did this, she gathered a group of women. She had to tell them all to go away again because she was too afraid to speak to them. But they came back the following week, and she shared her passion to get together, to support each other, to make good homes for their families. The Mothers' Union grew from nation to nation, and it's an organization that encompasses our whole Anglican communion, and it's been described as the 4th instrument of unity for the Anglican communion. In many places, in many countries, it's the place where women who are not ordained have a space of spiritual authority, a place of transformation for their communities. And I want to share with you tonight some wisdom that I have received from some of those women. So I'm going to begin a long way from this land and then bring us back to this land. I spent time with members of the Mothers' Union in Kagera in Tanzania, in Africa. And the part of Tanzania, Kagera diocese where they live is just on the border of Rwanda. And this is an area which was hugely affected by the Rwandan genocide. It's also an area that had been decimated by the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And so I went to visit these women, and they took me to their homes, and we went from home to home to home to share the stories of their homes. And these homes were very, very, very simple. Sometimes there was no furniture, just the mud floor, and sometimes there was 2 or 3 pieces of very simple furniture. But most of these homes had something in common. They were homes not just for that immediate natural family. There were homes that had been opened to take in other people who had found themselves homeless. In most of the homes that I had the privilege of sitting and drinking tea and sharing fellowship with, these places had become homes to many of the orphans through the HIV and AIDS pandemic and many of the refugee children. And at the end of that time of gathering, the Mothers' Union were having a service to celebrate in their local cathedral, and they acted out that beautiful part of Matthew's Gospel that talks about finding Jesus in the hidden person of need. And they finished their play and their song by saying, "Our hearts are our homes, and our homes are our hearts. If our hearts are not open to the Spirit of God, then neither are our homes. And if our homes are not open to the Spirit of God, then neither are our hearts. I'm a mother of different houses now, and in some ways I'm a mother of this house, this whare karakia. So I want to reflect to you now on some of the house rules, as we've heard them put, of this whare karakia. Because this house is a little bit different from the house across the road. And it's different because it's a house built for God and built to honor the person of Jesus. And so our house rules flow from the life of the person of Jesus. So there are a few different distinctives that I wanted to share as we think about homes tonight and as we think about our korero. The first is that in this house, there should be no place of opposition, because this is a house where people of great variety of difference are brought to a place of unity, of oneness as children of God. It's a place that everybody should be able to call home. And so it's a place where there should be no oppositional way of being, of identifying yourself. It's a place that reminds us that everybody should be at home here. No matter who you are, no matter what your age, no matter what your race, no matter what your gender, you are called to be at home here. So this home inspires us to think of our homes and how open are they for everybody to be able to be at home. One of the other distinctives of the house rules of this house is that no weapons are allowed in here. When we have our military services, all the weapons are piled up on the steps out there. No weapon can be brought into this house. This is a house that is safe. So this house and the house rules of this house remind us that our houses should be safe houses. And partly that's because this is a house that seeks to bring healing. In Jesus' life, he bore many, many wounds, and he spoke of those wounds being a source of healing. And so when we gather in this house, we remind ourselves that we are to be people of healing. And there are lots of sorts of weapons. There may be weapons that are made out of metal or steel and plastic. But there are other sorts of things that can be used as weapons in our world. And so this house reminds us to turn things that can be used as weapons into a way of creating safety and peace. And the other thing, as I think about the house rules of this house, is the irony that this whare karakia was built for a man who had no home. Jesus said to his friends, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests." We've just sung about a beautiful bird in a beautiful nest. But the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And he went from place to place, visiting those who were on the margins of society, being with them, eating with them, drinking with them, being family with them. And he also went to some of the most elaborate, beautiful homes and had the most beautiful parties and had the most transformational conversations in those places. So he was a man who had no home, and yet he visited so many homes. And then towards the end of his earthly life, he said to his friends, "I'm going to my Father's house. And if I go there, I go to prepare a place for you. And there are many, many, many rooms in my Father's house." So when we come to this house, we remember a man who was homeless, who became homeless in order to give other people a home. So let us remember the gifts that this whare speaks to us as we speak of the homes of people in this nation tonight. So I hand over now to Cardinal John to speak of the homes of this nation.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora e te whānau. Thank you very much, Bishop Ellie. Everyone needs a place to call home. There's hardly been a day in recent weeks or months when there hasn't been an item on the news about a family who cannot find a home, an individual who cannot find or cannot afford a home, an individual living in a car or family living in a car, people living on the streets in our towns and cities. We have innumerable stories, and we have first-hand knowledge of people we know who lack good, warm, dry housing. And we know how that affects people. We know even worse how no home affects people. There are all sorts of studies and reports. There is also our first-hand knowledge. The staff of our own social service agency, Catholic Social Services, tell me that housing is the most significant stumbling block for most of the families they work with. It's a stumbling block in terms of moving towards health and well-being, and for the good lifestyle that we would hope for everyone in New Zealand. One of our Catholic Social Services workers returned from pleading the case for a client in housing need to learn that there were 600 people on the council waiting list ahead of him, with 300 of them needing homes because of earthquake repairs that were needed. So we do face a dire situation. Our social workers continually come up against the fact that the lack of affordable, accessible housing is the biggest barrier to health and well-being and to families being able to live in some kind of settled lifestyle. That barrier is encountered here in Wellington, in Kaikoura, in the far north, all over New Zealand. It's experienced whether people come from a migrant background, a refugee background, or whether they are families who have lived in New Zealand for generations. One of the wonderful things, though, is that despite the desperate situations we see around us and hear about it, many people reach out to help others. One example of this is our parish in Kaikoura. Many people within the parish, the school and the marae have continued to reach out to assist others in need despite being without homes themselves or living in very inadequate accommodation. They're some of the real examples and stories I've heard about. But there are also reports and studies. A Yale University study in July showed New Zealand as having the highest rate of homelessness in the OECD. The latest Ministry of Social Development Household Incomes report, which doesn't include people living in informal situations such as motels and boarding houses, shows that the housing costs now make up a larger proportion of household budgets than anything else. Half of the poorest 20% of householders under the age of 65 now spend more than 50% of their income on housing. We hear that the cost of emergency housing in motels and other temporary shelters has now topped $50 million. The Ministry of Social Development Household Incomes reports also showed that those surveyed, which don't include people sleeping rough or in informal or emergency accommodation, 10% of children live in damp homes and 13% live in homes with a major problem with heating. As we've gathered this evening, we've gathered because we know that families need a place to call home. 2 years ago, Pope Francis issued a letter called Laudato Si', entitled Our Common Home. It was about the earth and the way that we look after it. But the day it was published, I discovered a paragraph which has inspired me ever since. Basically, in that paragraph, he talks about the living conditions of people in all sorts of situations around the world where they lack basic living conditions. And he says that for those people, he's actually talking about some big cities of the world where there's pollution and no clean water and there's shacks and shanty towns. And he says there's a feeling of asphyxiation. And for those people, life can seem like hell on earth. But then he goes on to say that the rest of us have a duty and an obligation to create for them a setting for a dignified life. We want all New Zealand, our communities, our churches, our community organisations, our government, to work together to create a setting for a dignified life. We want all people to be able to live the dignified life that all human beings are entitled to. To do that, they need a place to call home. A dry, warm home is essential, but not everybody has that in this country. It's clearly important, essential for families to have a home. However, in New Zealand today, it's not only the poor, but many other members of our society who find it difficult to own a home. This, as we know, often leads to ill health, lack of education, tensions and stress, which then lead to violence and the breakdown of family life. Having a home has much to do with a sense of personal dignity and the growth of families, as it is about the warm, dry place. Family and home go together. It's very difficult to bring up a family without stable and adequate accommodation. That's why in that now famous letter, which is really inspiring the world, Pope Francis said, I invite everyone, persons, social institutions, authorities, to do everything possible so that every family might have a home. An insufficient supply of safe and affordable housing is contributing to a level of poverty in this country that is fracturing the well-being of our people and our communities. Therefore, ensuring that everyone has access to affordable housing is perhaps the most important means we have of lifting New Zealanders out of poverty and boosting the nation's collective health and prosperity. In a different and more recent document, a document about family life, the Pope said again, it should be kept in mind that the family has the right to decent housing, fitting for family life and commensurate to the number of members, in a physical environment that provides the basic services for the life of the family and community. Families and homes go together, he said. Families and homes go together. New Zealand goes to the polls in a few weeks' time. As we prepare for this general election, let's ensure that we elect a government which will work to provide housing for all. A government who will provide homes that cater for all living in this country and create a setting for a dignified life. Thank you.